This 44-room mansion, the heart of an entire empire, was deliberately razed to the ground in 1982. The walls that remembered their secrets collapsed. The rooms that housed art turned to dust. They killed the house to save the garden. But this paradise was bought with the ugliest money in the world, with the roar of factories, and with the blood of the First World War. And now you will learn how an industrial magnate, whose empire was built on brake linings and artillery shells, created one of the most spiritual gardens on the planet. But the main paradox is not how he created it. It's why, to save the soul of this creation, his heirs had to amputate its body. Every great estate tells a story of ambition, taste, power. But the most important part of Innisfree's story is what is not here. From a bird's eye view, this place looks like a dream, lifted from an ancient Chinese scroll. Mist clings to the surface of the lake. Moss-covered stones lie by the water like sleeping dragons. Here, everything moves according to the laws of unhurried contemplation. Every curve of the path, every bend of the stream, is a carefully composed note in a symphony of silence. But the camera continues its movement, and amidst this meticulously crafted wilderness, it finds a place where perfect order reigns. Too perfect. A flawlessly level, vast lawn, framed by old trees. It seems unnatural, empty, like a scar on the face of the landscape. It is here that the key to understanding Innisfree lies hidden, because this lawn is not just a lawn, it is a ghost. Once, on this very spot, stood a house. Not just a house, but a citadel. A 44-room Georgian mansion, massive and symmetrical, like a bank check. It was a statement of status, a monument to Western order, built with money forged in the roar of American industry. It was the heart of the estate. In 1982, it was razed to the ground. Today, all that remains are a few stone slabs of a terrace leading to nowhere. And this ringing emptiness poses the central questions of our story. How could an industrial magnate, whose fortune was born in the fire of steel mills and paid for with the blood of the First World War, create one of the most serene and spiritual gardens on the planet? This was an era of men who could bend steel to their will, and they believed that nature itself could be bent in the same way, forced to serve their vision of eternity. But the main paradox is not in this, it is in what followed. Why, to save this living, breathing work of art, did its heirs have to destroy its most expensive and visible embodiment of power? To preserve the soul of Innisfree, it was necessary to kill its heart. And the story of this sacrifice turned out to be far more complex and instructive than the story of its creation. To understand the silence of this place, you must hear the roar with which it was bought, the roar that shook America in the early 20th century. It was the sound of steel striking steel, the sound of industrial giants grinding resources and human lives into pure gold. The name of this giant was the American Brake Shoe and Foundry Company, a company run by Walter Beck. At first glance, their business was boringly pragmatic. Brake shoes for trains, parts designed to wear out. The genius of this business model was in its merciless logic. Progress, movement, speed, all came at the price of constant destruction. And Beck's company was the cash register that collected this price. Every mile traveled, every ton of freight hauled, ground their product to dust, demanding more and more. It was a machine for monetizing entropy. And then came 1917. The world was engulfed by war. And for American Brake Shoe, this global fire was a gold rush. The railroads became the arteries of war, through which flowed soldiers, weapons, and supplies. The wear on brake shoes increased many times over. Profits skyrocketed. But brake shoes were just the beginning. The war demanded more. It demanded metal that doesn't just stop, but destroys. Beck's company quickly diversified its production. In its foundries, amidst sparks and molten metal, under the gazes of exhausted workers, they now cast parts for artillery shells. Every shell that exploded in the mud of the fields of Flanders, every brake shoe worn to its core by a military train, turned into $1, and every dollar became a stone, a flower, or a drop of water in Walter Beck's future paradise. The serenity of Innisfree was paid for by the anonymous brutality of a world slaughter and the hard, dangerous labor in dozens of factories across the country. Beck was a master of this world. He saw it as a system that could and should be optimized for maximum profit. He built an empire on the ugliest part of industry, on constant wear and tear, on the need for destruction. But he was going to spend that money not on building another gilded palace, but on something entirely different, to prove that even from the dirtiest ore, something pure and eternal could be smelted. There are two kinds of wealth, the kind that liberates and the kind that enslaves. Walter Beck forged his own, liberating fortune. His wife, Marion, was the heiress to an enslaving one. To understand Walter's ambition, one must look at the shadow in which his wife lived. This shadow belonged to her father, Wellington Burt, one of America's wealthiest lumber barons. Upon his death, he left behind not just an inheritance, but what would go down in history as the vengeance will. It was an act of posthumous tyranny, calculated to last for decades. In his will, Burt practically disinherited his children and grandchildren from his $100 million fortune. The condition was diabolically clever. The money would only be distributed 21 years after the death of his last surviving grandchild. For decades, Marion and her family lived knowing of this colossal fortune, but unable to touch it. It was a golden mirage, a constant reminder of the patriarch's power, which extended even from beyond the grave. This psychological fuel ignited a fire in Walter Beck. He could not and would not be the husband of an heiress to a phantom fortune. He had to build his own empire. His dollars, smelling of steel and coal, were real, and he was going to use them to make a statement to the world. But his statement was not to be another palace. The Gilded Age had spawned monsters, the giant mansions of the Vanderbilts and Astors, screaming of their wealth, but empty inside. Beck, an artist at heart, saw them as nothing more than gilded cages, devoid of taste and meaning. He wanted to create something different. His inspiration came not from Europe, but from the East, from scrolls and books that told of an 8th century Chinese poet and artist named Wang Wei. Beck, who had never been to China and did not know the language, saw in his works an ideal, a landscape created not for a display of power, but for contemplation, a garden as an extension of the soul. This was an act of rebellion, a rebellion against American gigantomania, against speed, against the vulgarity of new money. An industrialist who had made his fortune on the coarsest of materials decided to create the most refined work of art. He was not just going to build an estate. He was going to build a soul. But he did not yet know that to do so, he would have to declare war on the very land on which he stood. The year is 1930. America held its breath. The stock market had turned to ash, and a world built on the promise of perpetual growth was collapsing into an abyss. Banks were closing. Factories were shutting down. Millions of people stood in bread lines, their faces masks of despair. At this very moment, while the nation fought for survival, the 66-year-old industrial magnate Walter Beck committed an act of unthinkable, almost defiant audacity. He started spending money, not on stocks, not on saving assets, but on land, 950 acres of hills and valleys in New York State. To the world, it was an act of insane extravagance. To him, it was an act of faith. He came to this place not as a conqueror, but as a listener. For days on end, he wandered these fields alone, seeing not what was, but what could be. He held no blueprints. He had no master plan in his head. His factories operated according to the laws of scientific management, with schedules and strict calculations. His garden would live by the laws of intuition. Here, he began to design silence. His main idea was the cup garden. This was a revolutionary concept for the West. American estates strove for grand, open vistas for a display of scale. Beck, however, wanted to create intimate, hidden worlds, concealed from one another. Spaces that did not shout about themselves, but whispered. Each cup garden was to be a separate universe, revealing itself to the visitor gradually, like an unrolling scroll. His method was even more radical. This was not an architecture of construction, but an architecture of subtraction. He saw the landscape not as an empty canvas, but as a block of marble in which a sculpture was already imprisoned. His task was to remove everything superfluous, everything accidental, to reveal the hidden beauty. He did not build a garden, he liberated it. This industrialist, whose empire was built on addition, more factories, more profit, more power, now dedicated himself to the art of subtraction. He wanted to carve out a valley, to hone the line of a hill, to direct a stream as if it had chosen this path itself 1,000 years ago. He wanted to create a nature more perfect than nature itself. But a vision is merely a sketch on paper, and the land is a stubborn, heavy reality. It does not obey sketches. It resists. Walter Beck had designed silence, but to bring it to life, he would have to declare war on gravity. And his first adversaries would be the silent giants that had slept in these hills for centuries. The stones of Innisfree seem eternal. They lie as if nature itself placed them here in time immemorial. They breathe tranquility, wisdom, immutability. But this is a lie, an artful, brilliant lie, but a lie nonetheless. Almost none of these giant boulders are native to this place. They are immigrants, captives, brought here by force. Because the creation of Innisfree was not so much an act of gardening as it was a war with gravity. We must imagine the scene. No hydraulic cranes, no powerful bulldozers, only the creak of wooden winches, the clang of chains, and the groan of the earth. Only the muscles of men, strained to their limits, and the ruthless will of one man who saw these multi-ton blocks not where they lay, but where they were supposed to lie, according to his vision. Walter Beck was the general on this battlefield. He, who had built an empire on the precision of machines, now applied the same ruthless logic to the living earth. He demanded that stones be moved with inch-perfect accuracy. He made his men rotate them, tilt them, bury them, until they assumed the perfect position, as if they had grown there themselves. For his workers, the word impossible did not exist. It was simply a synonym for insufficient effort. The culmination of this titanic struggle was the installation of the dragon's entrance to one of the smaller gardens. The centerpiece, a boulder weighing over 10 tons. 10 tons of primordial stubborn granite. For days, the crew battled this silent titan. Every inch was a victory. Every creak of a lever, the sound of battle. This choreography of violence, where man and primitive mechanics forced geologic time to submit to an aesthetic whim, was the essence of the entire project. When the stone was finally set in place, it looked as if it had always been there. But this was an illusion born of sweat and risk. This harmony was purchased at the breaking point. Each of these stones is not just an element of the landscape. It is a frozen act of will. Every lever that moved this boulder was paid for by hundreds of brake pads, ground to dust thousands of miles away. Walter Beck had subdued the firmament. He had proven he could command stone. But his true goal was far more fluid and elusive. He was going to command an entire valley to drown. At the heart of every great garden lies water. It is its blood, its soul, its mirror. But in Innisfree, water was not found. It was created, and created on a scale befitting an industrial magnate accustomed to changing the world to his liking. Before Walter Beck lay a valley, an ordinary valley with a stream, trees, and meadows, living its own, unhurried life. But Beck saw not what was there, but what was missing. He saw potential. He saw a lake. What followed was the most audacious and massive act of invasion into nature in the project's entire history. This was no longer a war against individual stones. It was a war against the topography itself. First, a dam was built. Massive, earthen, engineered with a precision worthy of a railroad bridge. It was a lock that imprisoned the stream in the valley, and then nature, caught in a trap, began to do its work. Slowly, inexorably, inch by inch, the water began to rise. We can only imagine the scene, how the water first flooded the lowlands, turning meadows into swamps, how it crept up to the roots of ancient trees, condemning them to a slow death, how it swallowed hills, turning their peaks into islands. This was an entire world going underwater on the command of one man. He did not ask nature for permission. He dictated his terms to it. For weeks, for months, the water rose, forever changing the ecosystem, erasing from the face of the earth what had existed here for centuries. And in the place of the valley, Lake Tyrrell was born. 40 acres of artificial water, perfectly situated, with perfectly defined shores, reflecting the sky and hills exactly as conceived in its creator's imagination. This lake became the heart of the garden, the central element around which the entire subsequent composition was built. But it was a heart created by force, an artifact disguised as a creation of nature. It radiated tranquility, but its birth was an act of creative destruction. Every glint on its surface is an echo of the drowned valley. Now Beck had his paradise. He had stones obedient to his will, and a lake born of his command. But paradise needed a fortress, a stronghold that would look out upon this world of Eastern harmony, but speak in the language of absolute Western power. While Beck's workers battled rocks and water, crafting a landscape that was meant to look as if touched only by time, something entirely opposite was being erected on the hill above the lake. Here, there was no room for the illusion of naturalness. Here, the triumph of order reigned. The architect Mott Schmidt, a favorite of the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts, was building a house. But it wasn't just a house. It was the West Wall, a 44-room Georgian-style mansion, the embodiment of symmetry, discipline, and old money. Every brick lay in its proper place. Every window was a mirror image of another. The house's facade was as strict and predictable as an accounting ledger. This house was the great paradox of Innisfree. It stood like a stronghold of Western civilization on the border of an escapist fantasy of the East. Below, in the garden, everything was asymmetrical, winding, intuitive. Up here, geometry and logic reigned. Below was the poetry of Wang Wei. Here, the prose of Wall Street. This dissonance was entirely intentional. The house and garden didn't just exist side by side. They were in a constant, tense dialogue. The house was a fortress, built with money earned in a world of steel and competition. It was a statement to the outside world, a symbol of success understandable to every American capitalist. It said, "I am the master here. I have subdued not only nature, but the laws of the market." The garden, however, was a secret, a private space for the soul, hidden from prying eyes. It was a sanctuary where Walter and Marion Beck escaped from the world they themselves had helped build. If the house was their business card, the garden was their diary. They lived between these two poles. Inside the house, amidst the collection of Chinese porcelain and stern portraits, they were the Becks, owners of an industrial empire. But the moment they stepped out onto the terrace and looked at the lake, at the rocks, at the curves of the hills, they became artists, contemplators, fugitives. This house was necessary. It was the anchor that kept their fantasy grounded in reality. It was the facade behind which they could hide their true passion. It was the very wall from which they pushed off to immerse themselves in a world with no straight lines or quarterly reports. But it was precisely this tension between the two worlds that made Innisfree a masterpiece that its creator was not prepared to entrust to anyone but himself. Walter Beck built his industrial empire by relying on specialists, engineers, chemists, managers. Each was a cog in his well-oiled machine for generating profit. But when it came to the garden, his main work of art, he declared war on expertise. At the dawn of the project, like any other millionaire, he hired the best. Renowned landscape architects arrived, consultants with degrees from prestigious universities. They unrolled their blueprints, spoke of the rules of composition, of European traditions, of how it's done. And Beck would listen to them, nod, and then fire them, one by one. He saw death in their approach. Templates, cliches, lifeless formulas copied from textbooks. They wanted to build another pretty park, but he wanted to create a living soul. He quickly realized that the language spoken by this land was untranslatable into the language of professional terms. It could only be felt. And so he began to trust only one instrument, his own eye. The eye of an artist, trained for decades to see not objects, but the relationships between them. How light falls on a stone, how the line of a hill echoes the curve of a branch, how the silence of one space gives way to the whisper of another. He became a tyrant of intuition. His workers grew accustomed to his strange, seemingly random orders. Move that boulder 3 inches to the left. No, put it back. Now turn it 10 degrees. Stop. Right there. He could stand in one spot for hours, staring into space, and then with a single gesture, pinpoint the location for a tree that would only be planted a year later. It was a display of unbearable perfectionism, but also of self-taught genius. He believed that he alone could hear the music of this place, and that any other conductor but him would introduce a false note. He tolerated no compromises. He accepted no one's advice. This turned him into a despot on the construction site, but it was this very obsession that saved the project from mediocrity. Innisfree was becoming the absolute, undivided expression of his ego. Every stone, every stream, every tree was a reflection of his will, his taste, his soul. He was creating not just a garden, but a self-portrait, painted with earth and water. He built his own ideal, controllable universe. But he forgot that there is a power that bows to no one, not even the most powerful of men, a power that could, at any moment, sweep all his carefully placed pieces off the board. By the autumn of 1938, the garden was beginning to find its voice. Young trees had grown strong, streams had found their channels, and the stones seemed to have finally taken root in the earth. 8 years of titanic labor had turned a dream into reality. Walter Beck, a man accustomed to controlling everything, from the composition of steel to the movement of multi-ton boulders, could look upon his man-made world with satisfaction. It was nearly perfect. But on September 21st, nature decided to remind him who the true master was. It came from the south, a monster that would later be called the Great New England Hurricane. The meteorological reports of that era were primitive. No one was prepared for its fury. It slammed into the coast with a force unseen for generations and moved inland, bringing chaos with it. For Innisfree, it was the apocalypse. The wind, roaring at over 100 miles per hour, turned the air into a weapon. It tore not leaves from the trees. It tore branches, trunks. It ripped them out by the roots. Centuries-old oaks and maples, which had stood here since before America's birth, fell like matchsticks, their deathly crackle drowned out by the roar of the storm. The young, fragile garden, the child of 8 years of care, was torn to shreds. Meticulously crafted compositions were annihilated. Paths were buried. Streams turned into raging torrents of mud. The lake, born of human will, now battered its dam like a wild beast trying to break free. When the storm subsided, the Becks emerged from their fortress and saw ruins. This was not just a natural disaster. It was a personal blow. Their carefully constructed world, their refuge from the ugliness of the industrial age, proved to be fragile and vulnerable. Nature, which Walter had so arrogantly improved and guided, struck back, demonstrating its true, primal power. Anyone else in his place might have given up, might have seen it as a sign of the futility of their efforts. But Walter Beck was made of the same stubborn material as his steel. For him, this was not a defeat, but merely another obstacle. Months of painstaking, agonizing restoration began. Chainsaws whined where silence had once reigned. Dozens of workers cleared the debris. Every surviving shrub, every broken tree was inspected and saved if possible. The hurricane did not break them. It tempered their obsession. They weren't just restoring the garden. They were rebuilding it, even more stubbornly, more fiercely. They proved to the elements that their will was stronger. And soon, into this wounded but unconquered paradise, a guest was due to arrive. A guest whose visit would become the ultimate justification for the Beck's struggle. Walter and Marion Beck created a world that was closed off from the world. Their home didn't resound with balls. Their names rarely appeared in society columns. They lived in voluntary exile, surrounded by their creation, which only they understood. Or so they thought. But one day, an envoy from the very world that had inspired their feat arrived in their secluded universe. The guest was not just a diplomat. He was Hu Shi, the Chinese ambassador to the United States, one of the greatest philosophers and intellectuals of his time. A man for whom the poetry of Wang Wei was not an exotic hobby, but part of his cultural code. For the Becks, this visit was not a social event. It was a test. For decades, they had studied Chinese art through scrolls, books, and museum artifacts. They had never been to China. Everything they had created was an interpretation, a fantasy, an attempt to divine the soul of a distant culture by looking at its reflection. And now, the bearer of that soul, the living embodiment of a 1,000-year-old tradition, was walking through their garden. We can imagine how Walter Beck, usually imperious and self-assured, led his guest along the winding paths. He wasn't just showing him beautiful views. He was showing him his ideas, embodied in stone and water. Here is the borrowed scenery, where a distant hill becomes part of the garden. Here is an asymmetrical composition of boulders, symbolizing mountains. Here is a stream that murmurs with a specific tonality, because stones of the right shape are laid beneath the water. And Hushi looked, listened, and understood. He saw not an imitation. He saw a dialogue. He saw how an American industrialist, a man from the world of steel and machines, had managed to grasp the very essence of Chinese aesthetics. The striving for harmony between man and nature, the understanding that a garden is not a collection of elements, but a state of mind. For Walter and Marion, his approval was the highest form of recognition. It was a triumph. Their blind, intuitive interpretation had proven correct. Their work was understood and appreciated by the one whose opinion mattered to them. But this visit also highlighted something else. It illuminated their deep, almost tragic loneliness. They had created an entire world so complex and refined that they could only truly share it with a select few. They had built a paradise, but could invite almost no one into it. And while they enjoyed their intellectual triumph, behind the scenes of this paradise, an entire army worked, whose hands upheld this fragile illusion. From the terrace of his home, Walter Beck saw harmony. He saw a landscape that seemed to be the creation of nature itself, only lightly touched by an artist's hand. But this naturalness was the most expensive and labor-intensive illusion of his life. Behind the scenes of this perfect world, a relentless war was being waged, and it was fought by a small army. In its best years, more than 20 gardeners worked at Innisfree. They were the invisible soldiers in Beck's battle for perfection. Their day began at dawn and ended at dusk, and it was dedicated not so much to creation as to struggle, a struggle against entropy. Nature does not like perfect order. It strives for chaos. And every day, the gardeners fought back. They pulled weeds that sought to choke the rare mosses. They pruned branches that violated the carefully constructed lines. They cleared streams of fallen leaves to preserve the purity of their sound. They battled diseases, insects, drought, and excess moisture. Their work was a never-ending cycle. The illusion of being untouched required thousands of hours of manual, painstaking labor. A stone that looked as if it had lain there for an eternity had to be regularly cleaned of excess moss. The grass on the slope, which appeared wild, was actually trimmed by hand, with shears, so as not to disturb its texture with a lawnmower. It was a choreography of control. Walter Beck, a master of scientific management in his factories, applied the same principles here. Every gardener knew his section, his task, but he himself always remained the principal conductor. His sharp eye noticed the slightest deviation from the plan, a weed growing in the wrong place, a branch that broke the harmony. This army was the living embodiment of the Innisfree paradox. They expended colossal effort to make their work invisible. Their task was to create a world that denied their very existence. The better they worked, the more it seemed that no human foot had ever trod here. The cost of this illusion was enormous. Every hour of their labor was paid for with money earned at the other end of the spectrum, in a world where efficiency and speed were valued above all else. The garden, which invited one to slow down and contemplate, was maintained by the fastest and most ruthless economy in the world. And while this army held back the onslaught of nature, its general, its creator, felt his own time coming to an end. He needed to add the final touch. 30 years had passed, 30 years of battling gravity, water, and chaos. The boy who dreamed of becoming an artist became an industrial magnate, and then, in his twilight years, he finally painted his masterpiece. Only its canvas was 950 acres of land. Walter Beck was nearly 90. His body was aging, but his gaze remained just as sharp. He saw what others did not. He saw how his trees had matured, how their character had changed. He saw how water and wind over 30 years had honed the lines of his stones, making them even more perfect. He saw his garden not as a finished object, but as a living, breathing organism. And he understood that his work would never be finished. A factory can be built and launched, but a garden cannot be built. It can only be grown. He knew that when the gardener dies, the garden dies too, unless it finds a new guardian. In these final years, his work became even more refined. He was no longer moving mountains. He was making the last, barely perceptible touches. He might spend an entire day deciding where to plant a single fern. He chose its place not by the rules of botany, but by the laws of light and shadow, creating a tiny scene that perhaps only 1 in 1,000 visitors would notice. These final touches were his farewell, his dialogue with the future. Every tree he planted was a message to eternity, a hope that someone else would see his vision and continue his work. The camera shows him, now gray and frail, sitting in a chair on the terrace of his house. His gaze is fixed on the lake, on the hills, on the world he had created from his will and his money. He had achieved his goal. He had built his Eden on earth. He had created a masterpiece that, he believed, would outlive him, his corporation, his very era. He had built his fortress against time, but now, on the threshold of eternity, he faced the most important and most terrifying question. What happens to paradise when its creator is gone? What will become of this living, fragile masterpiece when Adam and Eve have departed? He had done everything to create it. But had he done enough to save it? What was life like inside this paradise? Looking at the scale of the estate, at the 44-room mansion, the imagination paints pictures of brilliant receptions, balls, lines of cars bringing the nation's elite. But the reality was deafeningly quiet. The life of Walter and Marion Beck at Innisfree was not a celebration, but a devotion. Their days were governed not by the social calendar, but by the rhythm of the garden. The main event was not receiving guests, but the daily tour of the grounds. Early in the morning, Walter, and later Marion, would leave the house and begin their ritual. They walked along familiar paths, but each time their eyes searched for something new, a blooming flower, a changed hue of the foliage, the play of light on the water. The garden was their interlocutor, their partner, their child. Their world was hermetically sealed. They built crystal walls around themselves, through which they saw the world, but did not allow it to enter. Innisfree was not a house for living. It was life itself. Everything else, the business empire, society, politics, existed somewhere out there, beyond the hills, and seemed distant and insignificant. Behind the facade of the stern industrialist and his reserved wife lay a deep, almost childlike attachment to this place. This is revealed in small, almost invisible details. In a secluded corner of the garden stands a small stone memorial. It is not dedicated to a great man or a historic event. It is dedicated to the Beck's beloved dog, who died tragically. This modest stone is a rare and therefore particularly moving example of personal emotion breaking through an armor of restraint. For them, this was not a golden cage. It was a voluntary monastery, a monastery dedicated to the service of beauty. They were its first priests, its guardians, its prisoners. They gave it their money, their time, and the rest of their lives. They created a perfect, self-sufficient world. But every world has an end. And when the creators were gone, their creation faced a harsh truth. It turned out that maintaining paradise on earth costs far more than building it. And to save its soul, its body would have to be sacrificed. Walter Beck died in 1954. Marion outlived him by 5 years, passing away in 1959. They left behind detailed instructions, a foundation, and a dream that their garden would live forever. But they also left behind a time bomb, and the name of that bomb was the house. When the estate came under the management of a board of trustees, the numbers on the paper told a terrible truth. The money left by the Becks was catastrophically insufficient. Maintaining the garden in its pristine state required colossal expenditures. But there was one line item that, like a black hole, was devouring the budget. It was the mansion. The 44-room fortress, designed by Mott Schmidt, had transformed from a symbol of power into an unbearable weight, heating the gigantic empty halls, repairing the leaking roof, property taxes. Every bill for the house's upkeep was a death sentence for some corner of the garden. Every dollar spent polishing the parquet floor in a ballroom where no one danced was a dollar taken from the gardener who battled the weeds by the lake. The foundation faced an unthinkable choice, a choice worthy of a Greek tragedy. Preserve the facade, the symbol of wealth, the visible part of the legacy, and allow the garden, its soul, to slowly die from neglect, or commit an act of monstrous, unthinkable sacrilege. The decision took years. It was agony. But in the end, logic triumphed over sentimentality, a cruel, surgical logic. To save the living work of art, it was necessary to amputate the dead symbol of vanity. In 1982, construction equipment rolled up to the west facade of Innisfree. What took years to build was destroyed in weeks. The walls that remembered the Becks' quiet evenings crumbled. The rooms that housed their collection of Asian art turned to dust. The house, which had been the anchor of their world, its undeniable center, ceased to exist. It was an act of surgical self-sacrifice, an act of desperate love for the Becks' legacy. The guardians of their garden understood something that perhaps the creators themselves did not fully grasp. The true value of Innisfree was not in the brick, but in the petal, not in the demonstration of wealth, but in the feeling of peace. They killed the house to save the garden. They left an emptiness in its place. But it was this very emptiness that became the guarantee of its eternal life. We return to where we began, to this empty, perfect lawn that was once the center of power for the entire estate. But now, this emptiness is not silent. It speaks. It even screams. It screams that Innisfree survived not because of what was built, but because of what was destroyed. It survived because its guardians dared to destroy its past to give it a future. The ghost of 44 rooms has vanished. The industrial empire of Abex, a giant built on steel and efficiency, dissolved in a series of mergers and acquisitions, becoming just a line in archival business reports. The money earned from brake shoes and artillery shells dissipated like smoke. But the fragile garden, bought with that money, outlasted everything. It outlived its creators, their house, their corporation. Today, a handful of people fight for this paradise. 4 or 5 gardeners instead of an army of more than 20. They continue to wage the same war against entropy as their predecessors, constantly fighting for the existence of this living masterpiece. And the garden continues to bloom because one day it was recognized not just as property, but as art. The story of Innisfree is not a story of what money can buy. It is a story of what must be destroyed to preserve something truly valuable, about how the ugliest underbelly of industry can, through the alchemy of human ambition, be transformed into pure beauty. And in this silence, purchased with the roar of factories, the main question remains: What ultimately defines the value of a legacy? What we have built, or what we dared to destroy to save it? The story of Innisfree is an alchemical process in which the roar of factories and the cruelty of industry were smelted into silence and harmony. But the true legacy was not the beauty itself, but the harsh wisdom learned that to save a creation's soul, it is sometimes necessary to sacrifice its body. So what ultimately defines the value of our legacy? The grand monuments we erect as proof of our power, or the emptiness we dare to leave in their place to preserve something truly alive? This question has no single answer, and that is its power. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which choice would you make? And if stories like these make you think, support our channel with a subscription and a like so we can continue to tell them.